All right, I'm going to save your hiney, I promise. There's an issue I run into all the time at the brokerage, both with new and experienced agents. And I'm going to articulate this with a story. And unfortunately, this is a story I've heard many times in many different shapes and fashions. And so here's the story. Agent calls me up and he's frantic and he says, we're supposed to close tomorrow. The seller was supposed to replace a defective roof, and we had a quote from ABC Roofing. We show up today. The roof was replaced, but it was replaced by somebody that's not a roofing company, some handyman. It wasn't the right type of roof. It was crooked. It's terrible. And I need you to help because we need to go back and force this seller to either, replace the roof with ABC Roofing or fix what they've done, or we want to terminate. And I say, okay, I got you. I do the same thing every time. I say, let me pull the contract and see what's in there. So I get in there and I pull up the amendment, and what do I find? An amendment that says seller to replace the roof before closing. Well, my question to my agent was, did the seller replace the roof prior to closing? He says, well, yes. Well, they have done their contractual obligation. And he says, yeah, but we had the estimate from ABC Roofing. They were supposed to do it, blah, blah, blah. This is what our amendment says, and that's what they did. They replaced the roof. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is writing good stipulations or amendments. Anytime we're agreeing to something outside of the general language of the contract, we need to be very smart about that. There will be some nuances from state to state, and I'll try to really illustrate that when I can. But I want to stay on this roof example as what we're going to do to kind of go from what's a decent stipulation all the way to what it really should look like, and you may be surprised. So we're gonna all agree right now, this one no good. Okay, so we're gonna start with something that has a little bit more teeth. I see this one a lot. I don't like it, but we're getting a little bit closer, and that is all parties agree that seller will replace the roof at no additional cost to the buyer. Because what I like about this is now we're starting to stipulate, is this going to cost the buyer anything? I've gotten into these situations before where, somebody does the work and it's like, well, who's paying for it? So at least now we're starting to get a little bit more specific, but this just leaves a lot out. So we're starting, but we can do much, much better than this, okay? Now, here's where we start to get into a stipulation that's got some teeth, that is a little bit more descriptive, okay? And what I've got here is I've got one that says, all parties agree that seller will replace roof at no additional cost to buyer, so we haven't changed that, and we added some language, seller to provide invoice and proof of payment to the buyer at least 3 days before closing. And so now we're getting a little bit more descriptive about what we want. So now we want to see that invoice that they have actually done it, and importantly that they paid. Because, put your real estate hat on, I'm going to take you back to license law school, because this is one of those things that a lot of times people forget about. If you have a roofing company come out, or a handyman or whatever, and they replace the roof, but it's not paid for, so the seller has not paid the bill, are they going to go after the seller, or are they going to go after your buyer? Trick question. They're going to go after the property. They're going to put a mechanics lien on the property. They may not do that until after closing. So if the roof is installed in month 1, we close in month 1, but month 2, the roofing company's like, hey, I never got paid. They're going to place a lien on the property, and now it's going to be the responsibility of the buyer to pay it. And so anytime we're doing work like this, I always want in my stipulations that we're getting proof of payment. If we're not getting proof of payment, that could be problematic for your buyer. And, some states are a little bit different, but most states really are going to follow this where, that mechanics lien will go on the property and it's going to be an issue with your buyer. Now, we can get even better than this because there's still some questions that aren't answered. And one of the things that is very important about writing good stipulations and good amendments is detail. What are we agreeing to? And let's get all that in there. So let's get to one that I think is even better than the last one. So we're going to add some language. So in this one, we state that all parties agree that the seller will have ABC Roofing replace the roof per the terms in estimate number 1234 at no additional cost to the buyer. Seller to provide proof of invoice and payment to the buyer at least 3 days before closing. So now we've gotten much more detailed. And the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to, when I send that amendment, I am going to attach that estimate from ABC Roofing to replace the roof for $1 billion because roofs are getting super expensive. But now we've got everybody agreed that that's what's going to happen. It's going to be per the terms of this estimate. And everybody has signed off on the amendment. They've initialed off on the estimate. Here's why I like that. I have had escalations come up where everybody agrees the roof is going to be replaced. Again, we're sticking to roofs, but this could be anything, right? So they've agreed the roof is going to be replaced. It's going to be replaced by ABC Roofing. And the buyers show up right before closing, and ABC Roofing has indeed replaced the roof, but they replaced it with a cheap 3-tab roof and not the architectural shingle that was in the original estimate. So the seller saved themselves, $5,000, $7,000, $10,000 on the roof because they put a 3-tab roof on it. And then, of course, I get the phone call, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I look at it and it says, well, it only says here that ABC Roofing is going to replace the roof, and they did. We didn't have any detail in here that it was per the terms of a specific estimate, and we had the said estimate with all the detail on it. We didn't have that. And so now I've got nothing to go back and hold them accountable to. And per the terms of this agreement, guess what? Now they're in compliance. There's nothing I can do. They've replaced it. It was ABC Roofing. I hope your buyers enjoy their 3-tab roof, or if they walk away, they're in trouble because they're not going to keep their earnest money. So that's why I like getting really descriptive and making sure that everybody agrees on exactly what that is, that we've got the terms written out, that everybody's initialed off on the invoice. Let's get really, really specific. That's what I like about these things, okay? But as good as this is, and I think this is getting really good, we could do even better. And so now I'm going to give you guys the same stipulation. So in the black, it's all the same language we just went through. All parties agree that seller will have ABC Roofing replace the roof per the terms and estimate number 1234 at no additional cost to the buyer. Seller to provide the invoice and proof of payment to the buyer at least 3 days prior to closing. So all that's still there. But now we've added this other section. And what we put in here is buyer retains the right to inspect roof after installation. If roof installation has defects, buyer may terminate agreement and earnest money will be returned to buyer. I really like this because a lot of times what happens is things get squirrely and things aren't, what they were expected to be. And now you got a buyer and seller disputing and somebody wants to walk away from the deal and it's not clear where the earnest money goes. So I like this because what it does is it puts empowerment back to the buyer. And this comes in handy a lot of times with repairs. Replacing a roof, maybe not so much, but let's say there's a big plumbing issue and there's a repair that needs to be made. I want my buyer to have the right to go back in and inspect the craftsmanship and the quality of that work. And if it hasn't been done right or it hasn't been done up to code, I want some sort of vehicle for my buyer to walk away from that. And what gets really squirrely is, let's just say that there's, something hasn't been done up to par, and you're representing the buyer, and you say, you know what, you didn't do a good job on this repair or this installation or whatever, and my buyer wants to terminate. And even if you have a termination provision in here, without that earnest money agreement, now there could be a dispute on who's getting that earnest money. And I'm licensed in more than one state, and so in some states, if the buyer and seller do not sign an agreement on how to distribute the earnest money, it automatically, by law, goes into interpleader. And that's a real problem. So you could have a situation where, one of the parties clearly messed something up, but because they both won't sign that earnest money is going back to the buyer, it goes to interpleader. Then they've got to go to court for it. There's court costs, attorney costs, and you may not end up getting much of anything after it goes to interpleader. I always say when earnest money goes to interpleader, the only ones that win are the courts and the attorneys. That's just it. But because we're going to stipulate this, now it takes the argument away. Now, in Georgia, which is where we do most of our business at Dwelly, the holder of earnest money can make a determination on the earnest money. So if the two parties don't dispute, and this could be anything from due diligence to somebody's in breach of the agreement, but the earnest money is distributed per the discretion of the holder, which could be one of the brokers or it could be the closing attorney. And so there could be a situation where, hey, listen, somebody clearly breached the contract, and so my buyer's going to terminate. We want the earnest money back, and you may absolutely get it. But there are some, even in a state like Georgia, where it could be absolutely clear. And I'll give you an example, due diligence. In the state of Georgia, if you can terminate for any reason in the due diligence period. But there are some law firms that will hold earnest money, and even in a situation where there is a due diligence termination, if both parties don't sign the earnest money distribution, they will send it to interpleader, which I think is madness, and we try to avoid that as best we can because that's not a good experience for your client. But that's why I like having that in there, because what that does is that makes it very clear if we do need to terminate, hey, remember this amendment, we agreed if we terminate for this reason for the roof, earnest money is going to the buyer. And that helps us in that decision on where the earnest money goes. Now you might see this and think, wow, that's pretty hefty. That's a lot of language to put in an amendment. And I will get concerns from especially buyer's agents. They'll call me. We'll be talking about an issue in an inspection, and they're like, hey, how do I handle this? And so I'll give them a recommendation on a stipulation. And a lot of times I'll get there like, man, I don't know that the seller's going to sign that. Well, my advice to people is always the same. If the seller's willing to do this, the seller should be willing to sign off on it. So if you put something together with all the details on who's going to do the work, and they're going to have to provide proof of payment, and you go through and you put all this detail in there. If the seller's not willing to sign it, they may not be willing to do it. And I would much rather know that up front than later on, a day before closing when everything's going sideways. And I've seen this. And so, and I think this is also good on the selling side. So as you're looking at these and you're realizing, to get to a really good amendment or stipulation, there needs to be a lot of detail. You might be coming at that from the perspective of a buyer's agent and thinking, this is really good for my buyer, but it's also good for the seller and for you as a listing agent, because I like when we get this kind of detail for a seller when I have a listing, because there's not a shred of sunlight between what the expectations are and what I'm expecting of my client. So it's not going to be one of those situations where they're coming back to me and they're like, yeah, but we could do this, or we could kind of skirt. No. This is exactly what they wanted and what we agreed to. Believe it or not, I know it's hard to believe, I've had clients say to me, well, it only states that we're agreeing to ... And it's like, yeah, but that's not the spirit of the agreement. The buyer wants this to be done a certain way, and that's what we agreed to. We can't hide behind the language because it's only going to put us in a situation at closing where, we're in bad shape. Because I've been in listings where I have gotten this amendment. And you're like, okay. And there's many times where we'll get it signed. But there was an agreement and there was conversation that a particular vendor was going to be used, a certain quote was going to be used. And I've even been burned on the listing side with this, where I've got a client that comes back and they're like, listen, I know that they want ABC roofing, but we want to save some money and we're going to use somebody else. And then I'm like, hold on, no, that's going to blow the deal up. And it puts me in a situation where I'm now saying, well, I know that's not what it says, but we know what the buyer wants. And it makes it difficult. So as a listing agent, I want all that detail so they can't come back to me and say, come on, Jake, you know that we don't have to do that. Let's use, Cousin Eddie to install the roof. He'll do it for $500 and a case of beer. No, absolutely not. We've all agreed. So the moral of the story here is be as specific as possible. When I see a really long stipulation in an amendment, as long as it's not contradicting itself, I like that because that gives me lots of detail. I know who, I know what, I know when, I know where, I know how much, I know who's paying for it. I know all that stuff, and it just makes me feel comfortable. If I get this, there's so many unanswered questions, and you may still close okay and everybody's happy, but I get the phone calls when things don't go well. And this is not the language you want in a contract when the parties start to become at odds about what they need to do to get something to closing. So make sure you're using lots of detail in your stipulations. Talk to your broker. Talk to your attorney friends. Practice writing these. I used to practice writing stipulations, and then I'd get a good one and I'd save it somewhere in a document so I could use it later. I know a lot of people we use a platform called Dotloop. You can actually create templates in Dotloop where once you start writing a sentence, it recognizes that you've got a template, automatically drops it in there. So use some of those shortcuts so you're not always rethinking this stuff. If you get one that's really good, I need to save that as a template. So do it, and you'll have a lot less pain, and I hope this has been helpful to you, and I hope that it saves you from impending doom one day, because I've been on both sides of these where they're done right and they're done horrible, and it can be really, really ugly if it's not done right. So happy selling, good luck to you, and thanks for watching.